Hey folks, it's Nate. Thanks for joining me at the art table again today. And we are bringing you our next installment of 20th Century Boys. We have moved on to Omnibus Volume 2, and this is where the story really starts heating up. By the end of Volume 1, we had made it clear that Kenji was in very real danger, both him and his family, and that the potential stakes here were life and death. Kenji wasn't careful, he could very easily find himself getting offed. Volume 2 is the natural escalation from that. And one of the great things about Urasawa's work is he manages to organically work in elements that will push the escalation of the stakes forward before we are even entirely clear what they are. There's a lot of things that happen in here. Most prominently, we are introduced to the idea of friend rejecting people. This means he has put people outside the circle of friendship. In a very real way, he unpersons them. And not just in the sense that he murders them, which is what ultimately happens when someone is rejected, but he makes it clear that these people are not going to have a place in the New World Order that he seeks to create. And this really establishes some stakes for our villain. We've seen a lot of the story from Kenji's point of view up until this point. Now we are starting to get a look at the opposition, not just through Kenji's momentary encounters with them, but in what they do on their own to forward their own agenda. We saw a little bit of this in Collection 1, when we saw Professor Shikishima's daughter being kind of seduced away from her family and into the cult around Friend. But now we are really seeing them operate on all levels, from the foot soldier to the leadership. And that is a really great way to up the stakes and make it clear that we are done with introductions and we are in the meat of the story. Now, of course, we're still going to be introduced to new characters. One of them is here on the cover, and he will actually not be discussed in this video. He's going to be discussed in the next video because he's not introduced until Chapter 11 of Collection 2. And that means that while you can still introduce new characters as the story goes on, and in fact we have a character to discuss here, we are really done setting up our characters and the world broadly. We know enough now to really start getting into the events that are going to shape these people going forward. We're not just looking and examining basic character traits about them in a handful of everyday situations. We are meeting these characters under stress, for the most part. Fukube, our new character, is introduced at a class reunion that was also teased in the first volume. And he and Kenji have some discussions along with their elementary school teacher. And yes, apparently in Japan they have even elementary school reunions. Don't ask me why. I think it just has to do with the much more tight-knit nature of communities in such a small nation as Japan. But they have this reunion, and there's discussion of what they call the spoon-bending incident. And this seems kind of weird. In fact, it is a really weird moment, but it establishes that not everything about Kenji's group of friends has been normal from the beginning. And Fukube remembers one of the strange kids in their circle of friends hanging around their secret base when they were younger. Now, it's established that Fukube himself was not one of the inner circle. That basically boils down to Kenji himself, Maro, Monchan, Karoyan, and Acho. And maybe Donkey, but for the most part, those 5 boys were really kind of the inner circle, and everyone else kind of revolved around them. Even Karoyan probably not, the most tightly knit here. Oh, and Yoshitsune. Who could forget Yoshitsune? He is short, he is kind of weak-willed, and he's scrawny. Very easily forgettable, but very important. File his name away for future reference as well. But Fukube is one of the orbiters, and that makes him a little more likely to be the person who's operating against them. But it's very hard to tell as well, because outside of Kenji and his closest associates, it could be anyone. In fact, it could be Ocho because no one's seen him in years. It's a discussion that is had a lot in this story. They know that Friend must be someone who read the book of prophecy they wrote when they were kids. And that's a very short list of people. It's this element of not knowing who of his friends Kenji can trust that adds quite a bit, actually, to the suspense of this. Every time you see Friend, you know you could be seeing a character you've already been introduced to who is operating behind the scenes. In all fairness, based on his build, he couldn't be Maro or Yoshitsune. They're the wrong shape, to put it simply. But it could be Mon-chen, it could be Karuyan, it could be any number of people that we have already been introduced to. It could even be Donkey himself, assuming he was, very careful and clever in the way that he committed suicide. And all of this it builds tension with every page turn. And that's something I think that Urasawa is really fantastic at, that he really manages to capitalize on in the printed story as part of his medium. Because every time you turn a page, there is a moment of suspense. Let's take this this page right here. We're going to discuss this part of the story in greater detail. But here we see a man following a Buddhist monk through the forest. And as we approach the Buddhist monk, we see a hand outstretched. The pursuer is asking the monk to wait, and the monk asks, "Why do you pursue me?" And there's real suspense at the end of this page, because we want to know the answer to that question as well. And then once we turn the page, the monk asks, "What makes you suffer so?" And we get this great... Urasawa is so good at expressing a mood in a single panel. And this is a sad reveal at a moment of suspense, but Urasawa is equally good at having very joyful reunions happen in this way, and very suspenseful things happen in this way. And it's particularly the element of suspense in the story that he capitalizes on excellently. All of the unfolding parts of this story culminate in the first major move against Kenji. So far, Kenji has been the active one. He has been trying to find out things about Friend. He's been trying to find out things about how Donkey died. He's been trying to find out things about his past. Now, Friend and his organization move against Kenji. Specifically, Kenji's niece Kana, who he is basically babysitting for. He's essentially the legal guardian. His sister has disappeared for like 2 years. And that makes Kenji closer to Kana's father than anyone else, any other kind of relationship you could give them. He's not really a babysitter. He's more of a father figure to her. And when Friend tries to kidnap her, everything goes wrong. There's a siege of the convenience store Kenji owns, or franchises, I suppose I should say. They break in the windows eventually. They grab Kana and almost get away with her. And eventually, in order to cover their tracks, they just burn the building down, and Kenji and his family is left homeless. And this is the first of many really great organic escalations in this story. Now, there are a couple of less than organic escalations, especially, unfortunately, at the end. And we'll discuss that more when we get to it. But especially here at the beginning, every step here seems to follow naturally. Friend and his organization are very interested in Kana, and then they are also not happy with what Kenji is doing as he tries to look into them. But it feels very natural for them to just try and grab the kid away and do something, whether it's just break the legs of or murder Kenji to keep him out of the way. They don't succeed in any of this, but them making that step is very organic. And the entire first 30 chapters of this story, almost 3 years of publication, culminates in this really great moment where we see what the dangers that are threatening Kenji want to do to the entire world. And it is a fantastic moment. It is a great culmination of very powerful storytelling. And it's hard to think of really insightful things to say without just retelling the story. What I would encourage people to do as they read this is look at the progression from plot point to plot point. There are points here where the story takes a jump that feels almost inorganic, where we move from following Kenji to following members of the FDP, the Friendship Democratic Party, which is what Friends eventually starts calling itself. And they don't seem organic, not even in the chapter they occur in, and they often don't begin to make sense for chapters or even volumes later. And I think that's pretty masterful storytelling. They're not boring or uninteresting, or they don't fail to develop characters, but placing them where they're placed seems very, very odd when you first encounter it. And a less skilled writer would have probably not included this, or not even have thought of these kind of moments, and told them in flashback later when it became relevant to the narrative as it is constructed. But 20th Century Boys is such a plays so loosely with its own timeline. It is always jumping back and forth to different points in the story, that I think this kind of positional change, where we see what is happening in a specific era from a whole bunch of different points of view, is also easier to follow. They don't do that in comics a whole lot because it's harder to make those transitions from point A to point B. Usually you want to, the accepted wisdom is that you do it at a page turn. You can change scenes in the middle of a page, but it's more difficult to communicate that in a clear way that the majority of readers will understand. And so people avoid doing it. That makes it hard to do something like a TV show might do, where you jump around between several scenes at once. Now there are techniques you can adapt to that. You can have two stories running in parallel on the page, one at the top and one at the bottom, or side by side. That kind of storytelling can come off as gimmicky, and it can overload because readers are trying to follow two entirely separate things simultaneously. The simple fact of the matter is, on the page, that comes off like having two monitors open and playing two different TV shows to you at once, rather than cutting back and forth quickly between a series of events unfolding simultaneously. So that can be a difficult sell. But Urasawa manages it here. And I think part of it is simply the number of pages he has to work with. The average chapter here is about 30 pages, I believe. And maybe closer to 40. And that lets him tell really good, really strong stories with multiple streams running through them. And gives us a sense of organic events unfolding organically. We get what happens in a time period in a pretty straightforward way, and we're not going to have to flash back to those events, or at least we're not going to be introduced to those events through flashback. We do sometimes flash back to events here, just because in the original publication they were separated by 4 or 5 years, so the flashback helps the reader remember without having to go back and actually reread a chapter. So that allows the story to have that more organic feel. Yes, we will come back to these moments again later to help us understand where they fit in the larger narrative, but it's very clear that this is a series of events that were all planned out to happen this way because of the decisions people were making, and not just all crammed together after the fact in an attempt to make a coherent narrative out of a bunch of different plot points. And that is, I think, the biggest strength of 20th century boys, which works on so many different levels, so many different time periods, as well as different narrative levels to weave its story. And if you read this and you really begin to analyze what is done page by page, which I don't have the time to do, unfortunately, but is really worth the investment if you're interested in visual storytelling. You begin to see how Urasawa is weaving all of these things together in his panel layouts, in his dialogue, in the way he handles transitions, and even in some of the really simple things, like things I never really noticed before doing this reread, like his panel layouts, where he goes full bleed as opposed to not full bleed. When he wants to draw your eyes to really significant events, they are full bleed. This is not just to create visual interest or give more space for the panel. This is a significant panel because this baby, Kana, is being given to a kind of slow-witted and semi-untrustworthy woman, and she's going to be in charge of Kana for a while. That's a pretty important decision to make, and that full bleed panel really emphasizes it. He does that. It is not random where he puts his full bleed panels. Sometimes they represent transitions. That can be one of the ways that he signals them to you. Another example here is, same page, okay? Up here, this is Kenji's mom on the phone. That prompts a transition to Kenji and Yukino as they're driving. And then down here, we transition back to mom and the worker. And here we see her feet, which is an interesting contrast to the way we see her up here. Because we don't see her feet. I mean, I don't know if that's the way we're intended to take this. Showing feet as a way to introduce a character is actually very common in manga. It implies they have just walked in, basically. And that's what's happened. She's just come back with Kana because she was unable to escape. Remember, she's not a very reliable character. So, yeah, lots of great visual tricks to kind of keep you flowing with the story as it moves from place to place, something that is very difficult to do in comics, and establishes that really organic sense of events playing out simultaneously to lead to the dramatic climax that we get in this story. Very good work. Again, anyone interested in visual storytelling or the art of comics should read some Urasawa, whether you read Monster or 20th Century Boys or Billy Bat or Master Keaton. Those are all great examples of well-written, suspenseful and entertaining and masterfully constructed visual stories. That's all I've got for you today. There's a like button and a subscribe button down below. You can use those as you see fit, and I will talk to you later.